2021 is the year of the census in England and Wales, and this is a podcast to help you learn a bit more about the censuses in the past and present. We are Year 8 students from Pontarddulais Comprehensive School in Pontarddulais, Wales, and today we are talking to Jill Matheson and Kevin Schurer.
Dame Jill Matheson was the national statistician between 2009 and 2014. That means, among other things, she was responsible for the census in England and Wales in 2011, and for making suggestions about how the 2021 census should be run. Before that, she worked on analysing results from the 2001 census and on surveys of the population. After university, Jill joined the Office of Population Censuses and Surveys, now called the Office for National Statistics. And her whole career has been about how statistics can help everyone understand what's happening in their community, in the country, and in the world. The census is at the heart of that, and now almost every country in the world carries out a census.
Kevin Schurer is Professor Emeritus at the University of Leicester.
Before coming to Leicester, he was a director of the UK Data Archive, and prior to this worked at the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure. At the University of Cambridge, and taught in the Department of History, University of Essex, where he was also Research Director and Director of the Centre for Local and Regional History. Kevin has worked extensively with historic census data, both creating very large data sets and investigating issues connected with households and families, such as who lived with who and the age that people left home.
Who started the census?
It can be interpreted really in two ways. In terms of who started it, if you're talking about England and Wales, it was essentially started by government, and in particular by Charles Abbott, who was Baron of Colchester, who introduced the Census Bill. But the real workman behind it was a chap called Rickman, John Rickman, who pretty much masterminded and undertook the first 4 national surveys in Great Britain. If you interpret the question another way, we didn't start it. We didn't start it here in England and Wales, or for that matter, Great Britain. There were some censuses before we took ours in 1801. Iceland was the first, 1703, but there are also a number dotted throughout Europe, particularly in some of the Italian states in the late 18th century. And of course, the newly formed United States of America took their census in their first census in 1790. So we were certainly not the first.
Why does census only occur once every 10 years? Why doesn't, rather than starting on like a new decade as well, instead of, for example, it's 2021 rather than 2020?
Okay, interesting question. Why does it happen every 10 years? Jill may want to comment on this. I think it's primarily money. There have actually been in the past suggestions to Parliament that we should carry out a 5-year census, possibly not as detailed as the 10-year census, but that's never been funded. So we have ended up with a 10-year census. In terms of why does it start? Well, actually, it does start on the new decade. New decades actually do start with a 1, not a 0. They end with a 0, but that's really incidental. It started just because 1801 was the first year we took a census, not 1800, not 1802. It's just that's how long it took to get the legislation through Parliament. So the first census was 1801, and it's just been 10 years ever since after that. Had we had our first one, had they got the legislation through to take it in 1800, then we probably would be 1810, 1820, etc., as is the case in America. So it's every 10 years, probably because of money. And the reason it's on a year that ends 01 or 11 or 21, 31 is really, I think, because of the timing of the very first British census.
Shall I add a little bit to that about why is it only once every 10 years? Kevin's right, it is partly money, but it's not only money. It's if you think about the scale of the census and how it's done, and particularly in those early censuses before there were computers, and where it involved thousands and thousands and thousands of people going round every area in the country and writing down information. And then in some decades, households began to fill in their own information, but it was all on paper and all had to then be compiled without the technology that we now have. It took a long, long time. So the pattern was established of once every 10 years. There is, as Kevin said, every 10 years, there is a debate about whether it should be done more often. And I think there is going to be another debate about whether we should do another one in 5 years' time rather than waiting 10 years, given, first of all, how quickly the country is changing, and also how extraordinary the circumstances are for the census this year with the pandemic and Brexit, of course, and the changes that's brought. So I'm sure there will be discussion again about, now we've got technology and now people are filling it online, should we be doing it again in 5 years rather than waiting another 10?
How much money would be spent on census?
Well, historically, I can tell you exactly, the first modern census is often seen in Great Britain to be that of 1851. And the 1851 census cost, listen for this, Jill, £33,000. Okay, the value of money in the past is not the same as the present, and £33,000 would be about 2.7 million today.
The 2011 census, which was the one I was responsible for, in contrast, cost about £500 million, £500 million. So a big increase. But of course, part of that is that there are very, very many more people that we are counting. So it sounds a lot of money. Indeed, it is a lot of money. I remember working it out that actually it costs about £1 a year for every person in the country, something like that. So it doesn't seem so much when you say it like that, but it is a lot of money.
Which is another reason we don't have them every year.
Yeah. Was there another reason for the census apart from knowing who lived in each house?
Again, if you talk about the origins of the census, we had our first census in Great Britain, as I said earlier, in 1801. Of course, at that time, we were fighting Napoleon, we were fighting the French. And also the country was very much in transition. We were experiencing an industrial revolution. We had arguably had an agricultural revolution as well. And Parliament really didn't actually know how many people there were in the country. It was very simple as that. We didn't even know whether the country was expanding or decreasing, believe it or not. And the reason that the fact that we were at war with Napoleon is very important, because there was a concern when you're creating most of your food, i.e. you're feeding your population from growing things and rearing animals in the countryside. It's a very labor consuming task, producing food at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. So if you take too many people away from the land, you're actually reducing the amount of food you can produce. And the big concern that Parliament had was, how many people can we conscript into the army without having a problem of feeding the population? It was balancing feeding the population and getting soldiers into uniforms. And for that, you needed to know basically how many able-bodied men you had and how many were working in agriculture. And it was actually that question, probably more than anything else, that drove the very first census in this country, needing to know how we can feed ourselves and fight Napoleon at the same time.
There was one other trend that was going on as well in governments, not just here, which was about the other thing, apart from feeding its population and fighting wars, the other things that government was interested in was raising taxes. And they really had no idea how many people of different ages there were, how many people were working and had incomes, and therefore how much tax they might be able to raise. So again, some of the censuses in other countries, and then us too in the 19th century, were Parliament in particular was really interested in how many people of different kinds of different ages there were, both for food and nutrition and for the army, but also for raising taxes.
Has the census ever been cancelled, for example, wars and stuff?
Simple answer is yes, once in 1941 because of the Second World War. It's also been delayed, postponed, which is not quite the same thing. Almost 100 years ago, the 1921 census was delayed because of the general strike. It was delayed a few months and taken in June. And also the 1841 census was delayed again until June. And that's because Rickman, who I mentioned first, who was the architect of the first 4 censuses, died in 1840, and the whole administration had to be changed, and the census was delayed as a result. But it's only been formally cancelled once, and that's in 1941.
Let me add to that, though, because of course Scotland didn't do the census this year.
Indeed.
At the same time as England and Wales. So the planning and always in the past, Scotland has carried out its census on the same day as the census in England and Wales. This time, Scotland has delayed its 2021 census until 2022.
Yeah.
And that, they say, is because of the pandemic and the lockdown restrictions. They felt that it was going to be too difficult to carry out the census, so they've delayed it.
Does Scotland have a different census than England and Wales have?
Thank you, Isabel. The answer is yes, but not always so. It's only had a different census since 1861. There was a new department in Scotland set up in 1855, which was the General Registry Office of Scotland. And after that was set up, as I said, in 1855, that has taken the responsibility for, and its successors are undertaking the censuses in Scotland. Before that, the censuses were the censuses of Great Britain, and then they were split up in constituent parts, so to speak.
Yes, but actually the content of the censuses is very, very similar. Not identical, but very similar. And that's because we have both Scottish Parliament and the Senedd in Wales and the UK Parliament, and they all need similar information. So the core information about the population is the same in all countries, and an awful lot of effort goes into coordinating the content between Scotland and England and Wales. So the forms will look very, very similar, 1 or 2 differences, but very similar.
And how many countries have a census?
Well, that's probably more a question for Jill, but around about 155, some between 150, 160, that kind of number today.
Yeah, vast majority of countries. And in fact, the United Nations has a policy of all its member countries, so the countries of the world, providing on a consistent basis the kind of information about the population that censuses provide, and almost every country does it through a census. Some don't. Some have other ways of providing information about their populations that don't rely on carrying out something that looks like a census to us. So some countries, for example, have lots of registration data about their population. So every year you tell your local authority where you live and who you live, and all that gets calculated into the kinds of information that we get from censuses. But almost every country does it, and they all do it, going back to an earlier question, in a year ending in a 0 or a 1.
Mm.
Some countries, like Australia, do have censuses every 5 years. So they also do a census in a year ending in 6.
How long does it take to complete and organise the census?
Historically, the very first censuses, the first 4 censuses, arguably were a lot quicker because they were primarily aggregate. What I mean by that is that they aggregated figures were sent locally to London. So normally the local clergy, or it may be often the overseers of the poor, filled in a form for the area as a total. So that was a relatively quick census by all accounts. The change really comes in 1841 when, for the first time, households are given us what we call a schedule. We still have census schedules, although they're rather different today. But a schedule, which is essentially a piece of paper, a form, is delivered to every household, and the household have to fill this in. That's then collected. So it was delivered in the week before census day. It's then collected the day after census day, on the Monday. Census day is normally on the Sunday night by tradition. And then the person who does that, what's called the enumerator, he then used to take those schedules and he used to copy them all out and partly standardize the entries in the householder schedules. And they would go into what's called an enumerator's book, and then they would all be sent to London or Edinburgh, if you're in Scotland. So even the Welsh ones would be sent to London. And then these would then be gradually tabulated. And it would take years, literally years, for the tabulations to be produced. So some of the first tabulations, the first tables they would rush out would be an overall head count, essentially, of the size of the population. And then more and more publications would come out, more detailed, both in terms of geography, detailed in terms of subject matter. But these would often come out several years, up to 5 years after the event of taking the census. Again, the next big change is in 1911, when a kind of proto-computer was introduced to analyze the census data, called a Hollerith counting machine. Essentially what it meant is that the answers were pre-coded. So a description of an occupation like agricultural labor was converted into a number, 99, and then that was then typed into a card, and there was a machine that could count all of the number of 99s on that card, if that makes sense, by punching holes in the card. So that was a kind of first proto computerized census in 1911. And then the first time computers, as we would know them in the modern sense, were used would have been for the 1951 census. So the processing of census data has speeded up over time, but also don't forget that as that speeded up, more and more questions have actually been asked, and the analysis has also expanded. So that's why I said it's how long is a piece of string, and you can obviously, once you've collected the data, you can carry on analyzing it. But most of the analysis are published in formal published reports that are submitted to Parliament and available to the public. But that's my try to sum up the process for you of 200 years or so less than that, But Jill might want to add about how it's processed and how long it takes, certainly from the experience of 2011.
Just very, very briefly, in about 2004-05, we started thinking about, we looked at how did the 2001 census go, and then we started thinking about what might the 2011 census look like. Mainly, what's going to be the big topics? What are the questions that we want to include in it? There is then a process of lots and lots of discussions with lots of people about what the content should be, and there's also always lots of people who want lots of information from the census. And then in about 2008, we started doing some testing with the population, members of the public. 2009, we built the systems for processing. And there was legislation that went through Parliament for Parliament to discuss. 2011, we carried it out, and we had a target of getting the first results within a year of Census Day, which we did. And as Kevin said, I mean, there's huge amounts of data that then keep coming, and people will be analysing that data in another 200 years. But the main headline results were within a year. So the whole cycle took from about 2005 to 2012.
Can immigrants take part and answer the same questions as your average citizen in the census?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely essential that everybody takes part. So really good question, Ethan, but it's actually for anybody. The only people who don't are the people who are just here on holiday for a very short period. Otherwise, the idea is to collect information about everybody who's here. And indeed, one of the questions is about country of birth. So it recognises that there are a lot of people who were born elsewhere, and this is now their home, and they live here, and they provide the same information as everybody else. And indeed, one of the important uses of the census is to be able to see how people who were born in different parts of the world fare. How are they doing compared with people who were born here?
And everything Jill has said is true of the historic censuses as well. You know, certainly from the first, what we might call modern census of 1851 onwards, birthplaces recorded. They took some. They stressed. Sorry, what I'm trying to say is that they recorded people who were born overseas as well. And actually, historically, it's slightly different from what Jill said. Even if you were a visitor here temporarily, you had to fill in the census historically.
Were poorer families allowed to partake in the census, or was it directed to richer or aristocratic families when it was originally made?
Well, as Jill's just said, and it's a similar answer to what we've just said about immigrants, the census always has been directed at everybody. Nobody is excluded. In fact, of course, historically as well as contemporary, if you exclude yourself, you're actually liable to a fine. So everybody has to fill in the census. Everybody has to report themselves to the census. Rich and poor, native and foreign, it doesn't really matter. If you're living here, then you will be treated exactly as the same as anybody else, regardless of income, regardless of. So even the Queen will fill in the census. And we can see that Queen Victoria filled in her census form. And so it goes up and down the land from richest to poorest. And it's important that it does so because it has to capture all of those social nuances and differences.
Why do you have to be over 16 to complete the census?
In a sense, you don't. It depends what you mean by complete. So the census certainly aims and always has aimed to count everybody. The question is really who provides that information, if you see what I mean. So historically, the person who was given the task of providing the information to the enumerator was what was called the householder, which was which was often, but not always, a male. But the householder would have to complete the schedule for everybody in that household, regardless of age. So you literally see people who, in the historic censuses, where it will say age, it will say born at 1 minute past 12 on census day, literally a minute old or something like that. So you're counting babies as well. In terms of being over 16, it's really about who is allowed to fill in the census. And I'm going to pass over to Jill here to say more about the modern practice.
Yeah, no, it's simply that 16 is the age at which you can become your own household. You can leave home and form your own household, in which case you are responsible for filling in forms. And it's the age at which, as Kevin said earlier, you can be fined for not filling in your form. And it's the age at which people are considered responsible for providing their own information on the census. But below that, under that age, you should still be included. It's somebody else in your household, one of the adults, who is responsible for filling in information about you on the census form.
What was the biggest household you have received data from? How many members were in the family?
It was, I don't know the answer to that. It's a very good question, Libby. I don't know the answer to that. It would have been lots and lots and lots of people. So if you think about, the house I live in now was built in 1870 something. In 1881, there were 14 people living in my household, according to the census. There's now just 2 of us. And that would have been very common. So we cater for very, very big households. Of course, it's not just people in households. We also get forms back from some very big institutions like prisons. You don't escape the census if you happen to be in prison. So prisons, hospitals, other big institutions with hundreds of residents all get forms. And the forms are designed to be able to cope with very big families and very big institutions.
And just to add very, very quickly, in the historic censuses, if you took private households as opposed to institutions, some of the biggest ones are because of residential servants. You have a lot of live-in servants. So you might have, as Jill said, you might have maybe 8 or 10 household members, but then you might have literally a retinue of 15 or 20 servants in some of the bigger, richer households.
How do you choose the census questions and who signs them off?
Okay, let me answer that quickly. When we start asking, we ask government departments, local authorities, charities, businesses, local communities, census users, people like Kevin, academics, researchers. We ask them, what information do you really, really, really need from the census? And we get back loads of answers and loads of requests for all kinds of information, far more than you could ever include in a single census form. So we go through a process of prioritising those bids. And among the criteria are, how important is it that we have that same information for the same point in time across the whole country? Do people understand? Can they answer the questions? Is it acceptable to them to be asked those questions? If you think everybody has to fill it in, then it's got to be something that they are able and willing to do. And in the end, it comes down to decisions about how long can the form be and what is acceptable and what is needed. let me give you an example of something that isn't in the census, and every time there is a big debate. We don't ask on the census information about people's income, and yet you would think that would be really, really important. And there are lots of people who would love to know, where are the really poorest households? Where are the really richest households? What's the comparison between them? What are the areas like that the poorest people live in, and so on? But it's not been included because we know a lot of people can't actually answer the question very simply. It's not an easy question to answer. And we know a lot of people won't answer the question on the census. So there's lots of other ways of collecting that information, but it's not included in the census. The final decision is actually made by Parliament. So the recommendations from the Census Office goes to Parliament, and it's Parliament that agrees what the content of the census form should be.
What is the most interesting thing you have found after reviewing data from the census?
I'm not a good person to answer that because I find the whole thing absolutely fascinating. But one of the games I sometimes play with myself is, I think, if we didn't have the census, we wouldn't know this. So there's a real excitement. So, for example, in 2011, when we were getting the first results from the computer, which actually showed us how the population had changed, not just the numbers, how big it had become over the previous decade, but also some other things about the population. So I find it absolutely fascinating to see how our country is aging, how long people are now living compared with even 20 years ago, but certainly 50 or 100 years ago. How the size of the households that people live in has changed. And if you think about why that matters, just imagine that we didn't know those things. Just imagine that we'd had the pandemic and we didn't know how many people of, say, aged 80 and over there were living in Swansea or Cardiff or Fishguard or London, and just imagine how difficult, even more difficult, life would have been for the health service and for government and for local authorities and for charities. So sometimes it's the basic things that, I get the most excitement from, because I can see just how important it is.
If I can just answer that very quickly. As a historian, what interests me is how sometimes you see things in the past which you assume to be modern or contemporary, like single parent families or old people living alone. And we see all of these things in the past just as we do in the present. And I think that's very fascinating, it's seeing the continuity and seeing the change at the same time. So thanks for the question.
What questions have you asked in the past that now that you think of would not be necessary in the present census?
Just very quickly, there's always a tension between keeping asking the same questions, because the first thing you get asked is how has something changed, and being able to make room for new things. That means that sometimes questions do get dropped. So one of the ones I remember being involved in discussions about was that probably seemed very strange to you, but it's not that long ago. We used to ask about whether households had inside toilets, because an awful lot of housing didn't. So housing standards have changed a lot, but people didn't have access to inside toilets. But over time, and I think it was 1991, it was decided that we didn't actually need to ask that question anymore, because so many, almost every household did have an inside loo. But that's just an example of how some things are no longer needed to be asked. And so we can make room to ask some new things that are relevant.
The other thing to understand about the 19th and early 20th century censuses is that they pretty much asked the same questions year after year. They didn't vary as much as they have done in the later 20th century. So there's much more continuity of the questions in the past than there is now, perhaps. but the questions were much more limited in number.
Do the newer censuses have more responses because it can be submitted online, or are there less responses because people feel like they could lie about doing it because it's digital? For example, say like, oh, it just glitched, like, or I couldn't complete it because like my Wi-Fi wasn't working.
Yeah, your Wi-Fi not working isn't going to let you off, but we don't know yet how many people filled it in online in 2021. It's too early to say, but certainly the hope was that it would just make it an awful lot easier for many people who are used to doing things online to be able to fill it in at a time that suited them at home. And so the idea was that it would just fit much better with the way that many people did a lot of things online. Of course, not everybody is comfortable or is able to do things online. So there are the options of filling it in on a form, or somebody will come and knock on people's doors and say, we don't seem to have a census form back for you. Will you fill it in now, or ring this number and we can give you lots of help? It was certainly true that in 2001 and 2011, we had to put a huge amount of effort in to persuade people to fill in the paper form, because there was a time in, say, the 50s, the 60s, the 1970s, when it was much easier. The people were actually sitting around at home on Sundays and were willing to fill a paper form in. Increasingly, that is not like that. People aren't sitting at home waiting to fill a census form in. They'd much rather do it on the move or from wherever they are. So the experience in lots of countries, the experience of some surveys here is that being able to complete it online should actually make it easier for people rather than harder. And it was very, very widely tested. So we'll see if that proves to be true when the results come out.
And just to add to that, historically, great efforts were made in the Victorian and Edwardian period in particular to make the census as complete as possible, 100% complete as possible, where you would have policemen also involved. They would go around the streets on census night and they would record people who were sleeping rough, people who were in tents in the countryside, even if you weren't living in a, shall we say, a normal residential environment. They had ways of trying to capture everybody, people who were on boats, people on barges. All of these things were taken into consideration.
Do you feel that the census has brought positive change towards the way the nation works?
Let me just go back to what I said. Just imagine we didn't have it. Just imagine we didn't have census data and didn't really know about the number and the circumstances and the characteristics of people in different areas across the country. Just imagine what it would have been like if during the pandemic. Just imagine what it would be like if local authorities didn't know how many school places they were supposed to be providing for. Just imagine what it would be like for the health service if it didn't really know how many older people there were in different areas. So it's hard to imagine how a modern country can be run without really having some of the richness and consistency of data about the country. So the answer has to be, yes, there's positive change. Let me just add one thing, though. It's not just about government. I think one of the things that is really precious and special about the census is that, of course, governments, national governments, local governments use census data. It's fundamental to everything they do. But there are a huge number of other organisations do too. So one of the groups that I became familiar with was groups, a charity that was supporting carers, so people who provided care for others in their own home. And they used census data extensively in order to be able to understand where are people living alone, or where are people living with somebody else who needs care. And there is a question about caring on the census. And that charity was able to raise funds and also direct its support and services to where support for carers was needed. So I give that just as an example of why the census matters to all of us. It's not just about government running the country.
And just very lastly, the other thing to add, you need a census in order to have it as a denominator to work out rates. So if you think about the present pandemic, you can't talk about mortality rates unless you actually know how many deaths are occurring in relation to the population as a whole.
I was just going to say thank you very much. I mean, that was fantastic. We had some fantastic questions and really great answers. Brilliant, I think.
Can you thank them from me? Because they were great questions.
They were really good questions.
Yeah.
Can I say thank you? I've been making notes myself of some of the answers because they're really, really interesting. Can I ask why, the census was delayed during 21 because of this general strike? Why was that? Was that just because people were out of work, and why did they delay it because of the strike?
I mean, why did they delay it in 1921? Yeah. They were actually worried about the safety of enumerators more than anything else. They were very worried about. Well, if you read the correspondence at the time, they were particularly concerned about the safety of enumerators. Don't forget, enumerators would go around the streets, and they were very worried that enumerators actually might be attacked. That seemed to be one of the principal reasons. But there was a period of great civil unrest as much as anything else. So. But it was the safety of enumerators was one of the key reasons it was delayed, particularly in mining areas. The mining areas in particular were ones that they were very worried about, and whether or not people would just simply, the secondary thing is whether people would just simply, because of the strike, just simply refuse to take place, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's partly what I mean by the safety of enumerators, because then if they're refusing to fill in their schedules, it puts a lot of pressure on enumerators, because they would physically collect the schedules from every household. So the enumerator would knock on the door and say, "I want your schedule," and some miner would say, "Well, you're not getting it.
Yeah.
I'm on strike."
Yeah. Oh, excellent.
Good. The Scots originally were not going to postpone theirs, but they were leaned on very, very hard by the English Registrar General to delay the Scottish census as well, so that they ended up both being delayed in 1921. And it was a decision that was taken very late on, so much so they actually had to send emergency telegraphs to all the ports, because they were worried that people would start enumerating boats in harbours, which were often done slightly in advance. So they literally called it off almost, literally with a day or two to go. There was one question on earlier that I think it got cut. So I wanted to hear what Jill's answer to it was. So I'm going to ask Jill a question. The question was, what do you think is the most important question?
It's the basic demographics. It's who lives here, how old are you, and what's your...
No. The question. This is Desert Island Discs.
Yeah, but I'm refusing to play, Kevin.
So what's your answer, Kevin?
I would say age.
Age.
If I had to have anyone, I think I'd choose age.
You can tell a lot from age, yeah. Gradations.
Yeah, if I had to,
I'd have age and sex, and
I'd know, yeah, but no, it's not one or the other.
But in the historic censuses, it was combined because you put your age in a particular column for a sex.
Yeah,
so
there you
can
go.
have it.
Thank you, very
can have age
good.
and sex, but only for the historic censuses.